Do you remember what you were doing on Friday, March 13th, 2020? Do you know what you were doing on that day a little over 4 years ago? Well, March 13th, 2020 was the day that Kansas City effectively shut down after the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 to be a worldwide global pandemic. We all entered into a lockdown period for what was supposed to be 2 weeks. I remember exactly what my husband Randy and I were doing that day because we had recently received our license to be foster parents. And on the morning of March 13th, 2020, we received the call that we had been waiting for. We had our first placement, a 5-year-old little girl. She needed to be taken in immediately. Would we be available? And of course, we said yes. She was going to be there that afternoon. So I very quickly made a rush to Target to not only pick up whatever supplies a little 5-year-old girl would need, shampoo, clothes, soap, conditioner, toothbrush, toothpaste, but also the supplies that we would all need to get through a 2-week lockdown period. I managed to snag some toilet paper, some Lysol wipes, and also canned goods, pasta, non-perishable frozen foods. You see, on March 13th, 2020, me and Randy's lives changed forever by welcoming a little girl into our home. But the rest of the world changed too. And while we only had our foster daughter in our home for 8 months, as you all know, the COVID pandemic lasted much longer than that. In many ways, we're still dealing with the effects. Certainly, it was longer than the 2-week shutdown period we were all promised. Now, church historians have this theory that the church goes through a major shift about every 500 years. So bear with me if you'll allow me to put on my nerdy seminarian church theologian hat as we take a look at some of these major shifts. Well, the church was founded in around 300 CE. Of course, it was initiated by Jesus' life, death, resurrection, and ascension into heaven. The church went from being a small, tiny sect of believers in Jerusalem to a global movement that spread throughout the entire known world at that time. And Christianity increased exponentially when the Emperor Constantine made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire around the year 313. But a major shift happened in the world and in the church in the year 476. If you're a historian, you recognize that as when barbarian invaders invaded Rome and the Roman Empire fell. And so the time came that we now refer to as the Dark Ages. The church kind of entered this period where really Christianity was only lived out in the monasteries, in the cloisters, among monks and priests. And it kind of stopped that worldwide global movement. It took a long time for the Western church to regain its footing and begin growing strong again. And then in the year 1054, another great shift happened. The Western Roman Catholic Church split from the Eastern Orthodox Church. They had major disagreements about language, about theology, about sacraments, and the role of priests, and each side called the other heretics. So 1054 marked the first official church split. We call it the Great Schism. And then in 1517, the shift that many of us are pretty familiar with happened when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg, Germany, and he began the Protestant Reformation. And so suddenly the church was splitting and shifting all over the place. New branches of Christianity, new denominations were springing up left and right out of the Western Roman Catholic Church. And of course, the church would never be the same again after the Protestant Reformation. So 2017 marked the 500-year anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. And church scholars and church historians were wondering when the next major shift would occur. Remember, a major shift happens approximately every 500 years. What would this next one look like? Well, of course, that shift came in 2019 when we had a worldwide global pandemic. And the church and the world, as we knew it, radically shifted and changed because of COVID. Suddenly, churches had to scramble to get their services live streamed or online. COVID raised theological questions as well as practical concerns. Where is God in the midst of a global pandemic? How do we take virtual communion? How will we collect tithes and offerings? What are we going to do about hospital visits and funerals? How can we be the church if we aren't able to gather together in person? Now, online church attendance during the early days of COVID was actually very high. People were scared. They were looking for reassurance and guidance into an unknown future. But unfortunately, that initial boost of online church attendance, it didn't last for very long. And it seems like many people left the church during COVID and never came back. It was almost like this global pandemic was sort of the excuse they needed not to attend church. It kind of relieves some of the social pressures or some of the guilt that they might be feeling. And so churches all over the country experienced drops in attendance and membership. And of course, our church is no different. Even after it was safe to worship together in person again, many people just chose not to come back for whatever reason. Now, Pastor Olu Brown, who I've been reading his book, Normalizing Next, he's a United Methodist pastor and church consultant based out of Atlanta. He writes that today, the church is living into her next. And the church, because of COVID, has shifted in ways that it can never be the same again. We now have to figure out how to do church again in a post-pandemic world. Now, again, for many churches, including our own, COVID kind of forced us to reckon with some of the state of the church and the way it had been declining over the past 2 decades or so. Our church had been shifting and changing long before the World Health Organization declared the COVID pandemic on March 13th, 2020. Now, I entered into full-time ministry a little over 10 years ago. And pretty much the entire time that I've been a pastor, I've heard the same story. The church is dying. The church is declining. The church is in crisis. We are losing members. Nobody prioritizes church attendance anymore. People are leaving the church in droves. And yeah, statistically speaking, that's all pretty accurate. Church membership and attendance has been in decline for the past 20 years, and COVID only caused those numbers to drop further. But perhaps COVID was the crisis that we needed to figure things out, to address the challenges that have been plaguing the church for the past 2 decades or more. COVID, in a way, forced us to have to reprioritize our values, to determine what was most important for us. What do we really need to be the church? What is truly essential to be the body of Christ in Excelsior Springs? COVID was a crisis, of course, but COVID became an opportunity for growth, for renewal, for transformation of the church. This challenge brought new opportunities and new clarity on what really matters. Now, in our passage for today, Esther faced her own challenge, her own crisis. Esther is one of my favorite stories in the entire Bible. The book is in the Old Testament. It's about 12 chapters long. You can sit down and read it in one sitting if you want. But it kind of reads almost like a fairy tale. Once upon a time, there was a girl named Esther who lived in a faraway land of Persia, and that little girl became queen. Although Esther was a Jew who followed God, she and her family were living as exiles in the land of Persia, along with many other Jewish people. They had been sent away and exiled to this foreign land by Babylon, who had since then been conquered by Persia. In fact, probably Esther was born and raised in Persia. She may not have ever known what it was like to live in Israel. At some point in her life, Esther's parents died, so she was raised by her uncle Mordecai. Now, meanwhile, the king of Persia, he kind of had enough of his current queen, Queen Vashti, so he exiled her. And out of all the women in Persia, he was looking for a new queen, a new wife. And Esther was selected to be a part of the king's harem. And so they kind of held like a several months long sort of beauty contest, bachelorette type thing. And Esther was chosen to be the queen out of that process. Now, around the same time, there was an evil man named Haman. Just like all fairy tales, there's good guys, there's bad guys, there's villains. Haman's the villain. Now, he was a palace official, and he started plotting against the Jews. He thought that they were foreigners. They did not belong in the land of Persia. He wanted to get rid of them. And more than that, Haman had a personal vendetta against all Jews because Mordecai, remember him, Esther's uncle, had slighted him. Haman thought that Mordecai should have honored him and respected him, and Mordecai said, no, I don't bow down to humans, I only bow down to God. And so because of this, Haman set out to kill all the Jews, and he got the king of Persia to sign a decree. On a set date, a few months into the future, all the Jews in the kingdom of Persia were to be killed. They either had until then to leave the country, for some of them the only country they had ever known, or they would be slaughtered. So all of a sudden, the new Queen Esther finds herself in a position of power as the king's new wife. Yet at the same time, her people were facing this dire crisis. What was she going to do? If she asked the king to protect her people, then it would reveal herself as a Jew. And not only that, she risked death by going before the king without being summoned. I guess he just had like a really full calendar or something. He didn't like to be interrupted. But if Esther did nothing, if she remained silent, if she had just hoped for the best, then her people would have been brutally killed. So Esther's uncle, Mordecai, comes to her through a messenger, and he pleads with her to go before the king, to petition on behalf of the Jewish people. And at first, Esther refuses. She doesn't want to die. I can't blame her. But then Mordecai says these profound words that you may be familiar with. We read them earlier, but I want to read them again. Do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. Who knows, perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this. Mordecai turned their crisis, their challenge, into an opportunity. He saw this crisis as an opportunity for God to come in and act, for God to use Esther to save their people. So Esther responds by doing three things. First, she calls all the people to fast and pray. She says, gather all the Jews in Susa, hold a fast on my behalf, don't eat or drink for 3 days. Me and my maids will do the same. And after that, even though it's against the law, I will go before the king. The second thing she does is she devises a plan to petition the king. And you can read it. I won't go into all the details, but it's this really elaborate plan. It had multiple steps. It involved multiple banquets or dinners. Essentially, she was trying to like butter up the king or get on his good side before she came to before him with this request. At the same time, she also had to prove that the evil Haman, the villain in the story, was plotting against the Jews. So she makes this plan, and then finally she enacts or executes her plan. She follows through with it. In Esther chapter 8, we read this. Then Esther spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet, weeping and pleading with him to avert the evil design of Haman and the plot that he had devised against the Jews. She said, if it pleases the king, and if I have won his favor, and if the thing seems right before the king, and if I have his approval, let an order be written to revoke the earlier letters just devised by Haman, which he wrote giving orders to destroy the Jews who are in all the provinces of the king. For how can I bear to see this calamity that is coming on my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred? So she has this plan, she enacts it, and you know what happens? It works. The king agrees. The king agrees to her request. Esther had convinced him to revoke the earlier decree against the Jews, and she saves the lives of all of her people. Esther turned her crisis, her challenge, into an opportunity. The crisis of the Jewish people became an opportunity for God to come in, to sweep in, and save them. We read about it to this day. And so, of course, she did the 3 stages. She prayed. She took intentional time spending it in prayer along with her people. She made a careful plan. She was deliberate. She took her time. She didn't rush things. And then she deployed her plan. She executed it. She set it into motion, and she didn't look back. Esther had a clear vision of how she was going to save her people, and she stuck with it. So let's return to our challenge. How do we figure out how to be the church in a post-COVID world, when church as we know it has radically shifted and changed irrevocably? Now, I've been here for about a year and a half. It seems crazy that it's been that long. The time has really flown by. But when I first met with you all, with church leadership specifically, in November of 2022 rather, one of the things that they said was that our church was looking for a post-COVID reset. Many churches, including our own, had just kind of been living in survival mode since COVID, just trying to get by, just doing what they could. And then our church faced additional challenges with pastoral transitions, and so our post-COVID reset had been pushed back into the future longer than for many other churches. And so for the first 18 months that I've been here, I haven't tried to rush that post-COVID reset. I took my time trying to get to know all of you, trying to make myself available for questions. I made space for healing. I wanted us to reach a place of stability and health. But now, it's time. It's time for that post-COVID reset that you all asked for a year and a half ago. Now, it's easier for all churches to remain in the status quo, to keep things as they are. It's comfortable to stay the same. When we don't change things, we know what to expect. We seek consistency because then we're able to predict what may come in the future. Staying in the status quo gives us a sense of security or protection. It makes us feel good. It reminds us of when there were better days in the past. But another word for status quo is stagnant or lifeless. I used those words in my prayer earlier intentionally because our sense of comfort is really just a false reality. Things that don't change die. Whether it's organizations, companies, or churches, the world around us is constantly changing and constantly evolving. And if we don't figure out how to adapt to those changes, we'll be left behind. We'll fail. We can only grow when we are willing to change. Or as Olu Brown puts it, your church's survival is 100% dependent on your ability to shift into your next. So what is our church's next? How are we going to respond to this opportunity? What is God calling our church, First United Methodist Church of Excelsior Springs, to for such a time as this? What is that clear vision that God has for our congregation? I'll tell you right up front, I don't know the answer. This is going to be a process that will take time. This will be a process that will take intentionality. It will be deliberate. Just like Esther's plan took time, she went into it with prayer, she made a plan with various steps and deliberation. That'll be the same for us as well. Discovering God's vision for our church, determining our next, will take some time. We need to be willing to spend that time getting clear on what it is God is calling us toward. And this is also going to be a collaborative process. This is going to be something where we need each other. I need your help. We all have to speak into this vision. Olu Brown puts it this way: vision is a team sport. It's not up to your pastor alone. And finally, this will require us being willing to get curious, to ask some tough questions. Why have we done things this way before? Be willing to change, perhaps, if that's what God is calling us to. So I want you to stick around after service because all of this is starting right now. It's starting today. What is God calling us towards? What is the future that God wants to plant in our hearts? I hope you'll stick around and dream with us for about 30 minutes after service. Will you pray with me? Loving God, we're ready. We are ready for you to call us towards your future and plant in our hearts a vision and a dream for what it is that you want First United Methodist Church of Excelsior Springs to do in our community. Help us to listen. Help us to lean on you and on one another. Amen.